Why would my son's name be hidden inside a house I just bought for $900? That was the first thought that crossed my mind as I stood in the doorway, my hand still gripping the chipped brass knob, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the dusty floorboards. The listing had said abandoned, unclaimed, a forgotten property no one wanted. That was why I could afford it. $900. Every last dollar I had left after the divorce, after the bills, after the quiet, slow realization that no one was coming to help me anymore. I remember telling myself it was a fresh start. Something small, something mine. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt wrong. Not dangerous, just off. The air didn't smell stale like an empty place should. It carried a faint trace of something recent. Clean. Almost like someone had been here not long ago. I took a few careful steps forward, my shoes brushing against grit and old paint chips, listening to the silence. Houses like this usually creak, settle, whisper their age. But this one felt like it was holding its breath. I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was what starting over looked like at 67. Unfamiliar, uncomfortable, lonely. I set my purse down on what looked like an old kitchen counter, its surface scratched but oddly free of dust in one corner, as if something had been moved recently. That's when I noticed the envelope. It wasn't hidden, just placed, sitting there like it belonged. My name wasn't on it. But the moment I saw the handwriting, my chest tightened. Because I knew that name. Ethan Collins. My son. I hadn't seen his name written out like that in years. Not since he stopped calling. Not since Rachel decided that I was more of a burden than a mother. I picked up the envelope slowly, my fingers trembling just enough for me to notice. It wasn't old. The paper was clean. The ink still sharp. And the date in the corner, last month. I felt something shift inside me then. Not panic. Not yet. Just a quiet, creeping awareness that this house wasn't just some forgotten place I'd stumbled into. And whatever I had just walked into had been waiting. I stood there longer than I should have, holding the envelope like it might disappear if I looked away. My son's name felt heavier now than it ever had before, like it carried something I was not ready to understand. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe this house had belonged to someone he knew. Maybe it was a coincidence. But deep down, something quiet and certain was already forming, and it did not feel like coincidence. I set the envelope back exactly where I found it, aligning the edges with the faint outline in the dust, as if I had never touched it at all. Then I took a step back and looked around more carefully this time. The kitchen was worn, yes, but not neglected. There were small details that did not match the story I had been sold. A cabinet door hung slightly open, and inside, there were 2 clean glasses placed upside down. Not dusty, not forgotten, clean. I opened a drawer. It slid too smoothly for something that had been untouched for years. Inside were utensils, neatly arranged. I closed it slowly, my reflection faintly visible in the dull metal handle. I thought about Ethan then, about the last time I had seen him standing in my doorway, his hand resting on the back of Rachel as if he needed her there to hold his ground. He would not look at me directly that day. He kept his eyes somewhere over my shoulder, speaking in short, careful sentences, like everything had already been decided before he arrived. Rachel had smiled the entire time, polite and distant, explaining how busy their lives had become, how complicated things were, how it would be better if we all just had some space. Space. That was the word she used when she took my place in his life and closed the door behind her. I walked further into the house, each step slower than the last, as if the floor itself might reveal something if I listened closely enough. The living room held an old couch covered with a thin sheet, but the fabric underneath did not sag the way it should have. I pressed my hand gently against it. Firm, recently used. I pulled the sheet back just enough to see the color beneath. No dust settled in the folds. My chest tightened again, not from fear, but from recognition. This house was not empty. Not truly. I turned toward the hallway and noticed something I had missed before. At the far end, one door stood closed while the others were slightly ajar. The handle was newer, polished in contrast to everything else. I did not touch it. Not yet. Instead, I stepped back into the kitchen and looked again at the envelope, still resting exactly where I had left it. Ethan's name stared back at me, steady and unchanged, like it belonged here more than I did. And for the first time since I walked in, I understood that whatever had been happening in this house, it was not something I had just discovered. It was something I had been meant to find, I did not open the door at the end of the hallway right away. Instead, I stood there, watching it, as if it might move on its own if I gave it enough time. There was something about the way it was closed that felt deliberate, not forgotten like the rest of the house. The other doors along the hallway were slightly open, uneven, like they had been left behind in a hurry or simply neglected over time. But this one was different. The frame looked cleaner. The edges sharper. Someone had taken care of it. I turned away from it for a moment and walked into the first room on the left. It looked like a bedroom, small and plain, with faded wallpaper peeling near the corners. But even here, something did not match. The window had been wiped recently. I could see the streak marks where a cloth had passed over the glass. The floor near the bed was clearer than the rest, as if someone had stood there often enough to keep the dust from settling. I stepped back into the hallway, my footsteps softer now, more cautious. It felt less like exploring and more like following a trail I had not agreed to walk. When I reached the second room, I paused again. This one was darker, the curtains drawn halfway, letting in only a thin line of light across the floor. I pushed the door open a little wider and saw a small desk against the wall. There were papers stacked neatly in one corner. Not scattered, not abandoned, organized. I walked over slowly and glanced down without touching anything. Bills, statements, printed emails. The dates were recent. Weeks, not years. My breath slowed, becoming more deliberate as I read the names printed across the top lines. None of them were mine, but one detail stood out immediately. The address listed on every page was this house. I straightened up, feeling the quiet weight of realization settling in my chest. This was not just a place someone had passed through. It was being used, maintained, hidden. I stepped back into the hallway again, and this time, I looked directly at the closed door at the end. I could feel it pulling my attention, not with fear, but with a kind of clarity I had not felt in a long time. Whatever answers were here, they were behind that door. I walked toward it slowly, each step measured, steady. When I reached for the handle, I hesitated just long enough to notice the small detail I had missed before. A faint scratch mark just below the lock, as if a key had been inserted and turned many times. Not long ago, I wrapped my fingers around the handle. It was cool, smooth, almost new compared to everything else. I did not rush. I turned it carefully, listening to the quiet click as the latch released. And in that moment, before the door even opened, I knew this house was never abandoned. It was waiting, and somehow, it had been waiting for me. The door opened without resistance, slow and quiet, as if it had been expecting that exact moment. I did not step inside right away. I stood there, holding the handle, letting my eyes adjust to what was waiting beyond it. The room was not dark like I thought it would be. A single lamp in the corner was plugged in, casting a soft, steady light across the space. Not flickering, not weak. Someone had turned it on recently. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the desk. It sat in the center of the room, not against a wall like most desks, but positioned as if it was meant to be used often, from all sides. Papers were spread across it, not messy, but active, like someone had been in the middle of something and stepped away. I took one step forward, then another, my eyes scanning slowly, carefully, taking in every detail without touching anything. There was a laptop on the desk, closed, but not put away. A coffee mug sat beside it, a faint ring dried at the bottom. Not old, not forgotten, recent. I felt that same quiet shift inside me again, only stronger now. This was not just a hidden room. This was a working space. I moved closer, my hands staying at my sides, resisting the urge to disturb anything. There were folders stacked neatly, each labeled with printed tags. Addresses, account numbers, dates. My gaze moved from one to another until something caught my attention. A familiar number. I leaned in slightly, my breath slowing as I read it again. It matched the last 4 digits of my old account, the one I had closed after the divorce. Or at least, the one I thought had been closed. I did not react right away. I simply stood there, letting the information settle, piece by piece, like a puzzle I had not known I was solving. I shifted my focus to the wall behind the desk, and that was when I saw it. A board. Not large, but carefully arranged. Notes pinned in straight lines. Strings connecting certain points. Names written in clear, steady handwriting. My name was there. Not in the center, but not on the edge either. Connected. Linked. Part of something I had never agreed to be part of. And then I saw his name again. Ethan, written more than once. Connected to transactions. Properties. Dates that lined up too closely with moments I remembered losing money, losing control, losing explanations. I felt no panic, no rush of emotion, just a quiet clarity spreading through me, steady and cold. This had not happened suddenly. It had been built, planned, layer by layer, decision by decision, and I had been kept just far enough away not to see it forming. I took one final step closer to the desk and looked down at the top folder. My name was printed clearly across the tab. Not handwritten. Printed. Intentional. I did not open it. Not yet. Because in that moment, I understood something far more important than what was inside. This was never about a house, and I was never meant to walk away from it without seeing the truth. I stood there for a long moment, looking at that folder with my name on it, feeling something settle deep inside me that I had not felt in years. It was not fear. It was not even anger. It was recognition. The kind that comes when pieces finally stop resisting each other and begin to fit. Slowly, carefully, I reached forward and placed my hand on the folder. The paper was smooth, firm, recently handled. I opened it without hesitation this time. Inside were documents, neatly organized, each page aligned as if precision mattered more than secrecy. The first page was a summary. My name, my date of birth, my previous address. All correct, all familiar. But beneath that, the details changed. Transactions I did not remember authorizing. Transfers I had never approved. Amounts that were not large enough to alarm me at the time, but consistent enough to form a pattern I had completely missed. $50, $200, $125. Always small, always quiet, always explainable if I had ever thought to question them. I turned the page. The next document showed account activity tied to a secondary profile. My name was still there, but not alone. There was another authorized user listed beneath it. The letters were clean, unmistakable. Rachel Collins. I paused, letting that settle without reacting. It made sense in a way that felt almost disappointing. Not surprising. Just inevitable. I moved to the next page. Property records. This house. The one I had just bought. It had changed hands twice in the last 6 months. Each transfer tied to limited liability companies with names that meant nothing at first glance. But the addresses connected back to the same network I had seen on the board behind me. And then I saw it. A transaction dated 3 weeks ago. $900. My $900. Recorded not as a purchase, but as a reimbursement. I stared at that line longer than I should have. Reimbursement. As if I had been paying something back. As if this had already belonged to me before I ever stepped through the door. I lowered the papers slightly and looked around the room again, but everything felt different now. Not hidden, not mysterious, just arranged, designed. I flipped to the final section of the folder. Printed emails. Conversations between Rachel and someone else. The tone was calm, controlled, strategic. She was not asking for permission. She was giving instructions. There were references to timing, to keeping things quiet, to making sure she does not notice. I did not need to read further to know who she was. I closed the folder gently and placed it back exactly where I found it. My hands were steady, my breathing even. There was no rush of emotion, no need to react. Because the truth was no longer something I had to search for. It was already laid out in front of me, clear and complete. I turned my head slightly and looked back at the board on the wall, at the lines connecting names, numbers, decisions. And for the first time, I did not feel like I was looking at something I did not understand. I was looking at something that had underestimated me. And that changed everything. I did not stay in that room much longer after I closed the folder, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I understood enough. More than enough. The rest would come with time, and I had always been patient when something mattered. I took one last look at the desk, the lamp, the carefully arranged pieces of a plan that had been running quietly without me. And then I turned and walked back into the hallway. My steps were different now. Slower, but not uncertain. Measured. Intentional. I passed the other rooms without stopping, no longer curious about the small details I had noticed before. Those details had already served their purpose. They had led me here. As I reached the kitchen again, my eyes moved instinctively to the envelope with Ethan's name. It was still there, exactly where I had placed it, as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I picked it up this time without hesitation and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once, clean and precise. I unfolded it carefully. It was not a letter, not in the way a mother might hope for. There were no greetings, no explanations, no apologies. Just information. A list of dates, transactions, property references, and at the bottom, a note in a familiar tone. Not handwritten, but printed like everything else. Final phase. Pending confirmation. I read that line twice, not because I did not understand it, but because I wanted to be certain I had not misread it. Final phase. That meant there had been phases before this. Steps. Progression. Structure. This was not random. It was not impulsive. It was controlled. I lowered the paper slightly and looked around the kitchen again, but now it felt smaller somehow, like a stage after the performance was over. I walked over to the counter and set the paper down, aligning it with the edge just as I had done with the envelope earlier. My reflection appeared faintly in the window above the sink, older than I remembered, but steadier than I expected. I thought about Ethan again, not as the boy I had raised, but as the man who had signed his name onto documents he might not have fully understood. Or perhaps he did. That question no longer mattered as much as it once would have, because this was no longer about confusion. It was about clarity. I reached for my purse and took out my phone, holding it in my hand for a moment without unlocking it. There were numbers I could call, questions I could ask, but I did not move. Not yet. Instead, I slipped the phone back into my bag and looked around one final time. The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like it was hiding anything. It had already shown me what I needed to see. And as I walked toward the front door, I realized something simple, something that settled into place as naturally as everything else had just moments before. They had built this carefully, thoughtfully, patiently, but they had made one mistake. They had assumed I would never look closely enough to understand it. And now that I had, I was not walking away. I was stepping back, just far enough to decide exactly how I wanted to respond. I did not drive far after leaving the house. I pulled over just a few blocks away, beneath a tall oak tree whose branches stretched wide enough to cast a steady shade over my car. The engine was still running, but I did not notice the sound anymore. My hands rested quietly on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed ahead, not seeing the street, but replaying everything I had just walked through. The envelope, the folder, the board, none of it felt chaotic. That was what stayed with me. It had all been so calm, so organized, like a plan that had never expected to be interrupted. I reached into my purse again, and this time I took out my phone and unlocked it. My reflection stared back at me for a brief second before the screen shifted. I did not scroll through contacts right away. Instead, I opened my banking app. The account I had almost forgotten about. The one I believed had been closed. It was still there, active, quiet. I tapped into the transaction history and began to scroll, slowly at first, then more carefully. The same pattern I had seen on paper appeared here in front of me. Small amounts, spread out, never enough to raise a question. Until now. I stopped when I reached a transfer labeled with a reference code I recognized from the documents in the house. My breath slowed, not out of fear, but out of focus. This was confirmation, not suspicion, not theory, proof. I locked my phone and placed it gently in my lap. There was no need to rush, no need to call anyone yet, because I understood something now that I had not before. This had been built on the assumption that I would stay quiet, that I would accept confusion instead of asking questions, that I would trust the spaces left between explanations. I opened the glove compartment and pulled out a small notebook I kept there. It was nothing special, just lined pages and a pen clipped to the side. I flipped it open and began to write. Dates, names, amounts, not everything, just enough. Enough to create my own record, my own version of what had been done. I wrote slowly, carefully, making sure each word was clear, each number exact. When I finished, I closed the notebook and placed it back where I found it. The engine was still running. The street was still quiet. But something had shifted again, this time inside me. I was no longer reacting. I was preparing. I started the car properly and pulled back onto the road, my movement steady, unhurried. I knew where I was going next, not because I had planned it before, but because it was the only logical step left. Not to confront. Not yet. That would come later. First, I needed distance, perspective, and someone who would see this the way I now did. Not as a misunderstanding, not as a mistake, but as something intentional. As I drove, I thought about Rachel, about the calm precision in those printed words, the quiet confidence behind every decision she had made. She believed this was finished, that the final phase was within reach. I kept my eyes on the road, my hands steady on the wheel, and for the first time since I had stepped into that house, I allowed myself a small, almost invisible smile. Because she was wrong. I did not go home that night. Instead, I checked into a small roadside motel about 20 miles out, the kind of place no one asks questions and no one remembers faces. The room was simple, clean enough, quiet. I placed my purse on the table and sat down slowly, letting the silence settle around me. For the first time since I left the house, I allowed myself to go over everything again, not as fragments, but as a complete picture. The structure, the timing, the patience behind it. This had not been rushed. It had been built over months, maybe longer, with the kind of precision that only comes from someone who believes they are in control of every outcome. I reached for my phone and opened it again, this time not to look at my accounts, but to scroll through old messages. There were not many from Ethan. Not recently. Most of them were short, polite, distant. But I noticed something now that I had not paid attention to before. The gaps. Weeks, sometimes months, with nothing. Then a sudden message, usually about something practical. Paperwork. Signatures. Small requests that felt reasonable at the time. I had always said yes. Not because I did not understand, but because I trusted him. Or maybe because I wanted to. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, my eyes resting on the blank wall in front of me. I thought about Rachel again, about the tone in those emails, the quiet authority in the way she wrote. She did not ask for things. She arranged them, positioned them, and she had done the same with me. Carefully, gradually, until I was exactly where she needed me to be. Alone, limited, manageable. I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the parking lot below. A few cars. No movement. Just stillness. I let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the table, opening my notebook again. This time, I did not write what I had found. I wrote what I would do next. Not everything. Just the first steps. Names of professionals I trusted, ones I had not spoken to in years but knew would still recognize my voice. A financial advisor. A legal contact. People who understood structure, who could see patterns where others might see coincidence. I wrote each name slowly, deliberately, as if placing them into position on a board that now belonged to me. When I finished, I closed the notebook and rested my hand on top of it for a moment. There was no urgency in me. No need to act tonight. Because for the first time, I was no longer behind. I was exactly where I needed to be. I turned off the light and sat in the dim glow from the window, letting the quiet stretch out around me. Somewhere, not far from here, Rachel believed everything was still moving according to her plan, that the final phase was close. I sat there, still and composed, and allowed myself one clear thought before the night settled completely. She had built something careful and controlled, but she had built it on the belief that I would never step outside the role she had given me. And now that I had, everything she thought was stable had already begun to shift. The next morning, I did not rush. I woke up before the sun had fully risen, the soft gray light settling quietly into the room, and for a moment, I simply sat there, listening to the stillness. There was no confusion left, no lingering doubt, only a clear, steady understanding of what needed to happen next. I reached for my phone and made the first call. It was not emotional. It was not confrontational. It was precise. A name from my notebook. Someone who had known me long before any of this began. Someone who understood structure, contracts, and the quiet ways people tried to move things without being noticed. I spoke calmly, giving only the necessary details, not everything, just enough to open the door for a deeper look. There was a pause on the other end, then a simple response. Bring everything you have. I ended the call and got ready without hesitation. The drive into the city was quiet, the roads just beginning to fill, the world moving as if nothing had changed. But for me, everything had. By mid-morning, I was sitting across from a polished desk, the folder from the house now resting in front of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at. They did not speak immediately. They turned each page slowly, carefully, their expression neutral, but focused. I watched without interrupting, my hands folded neatly in my lap. When they finally looked up, their voice was calm, measured. This was not an accident. I nodded once. I already knew that. They continued, explaining what I had begun to understand on my own. The pattern of small transfers. The layered ownership of the property. The way my name had been used, positioned, not as a mistake, but as a shield, a buffer, a way to keep everything just far enough from direct scrutiny. I listened to every word without reacting, letting the full weight of it settle in a way that was no longer overwhelming, only clarifying. When they finished, there was a brief silence before the next question. Do you want to proceed? I did not answer immediately. Instead, I thought about the house, the desk, the board, the careful lines connecting everything together. I thought about Ethan, about the distance, the silence, the choices that had been made somewhere between trust and control. And I thought about Rachel, about the confidence behind every decision she had written down, believing no one would ever step back far enough to see the whole picture. I lifted my eyes and met theirs directly. Yes, I said, my voice steady even. But not all at once. They nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. This would not be rushed. It would not be loud. It would be careful, layered, just like the plan that had brought me here. I gathered my things and stood, feeling something settle into place as I walked out of that office and into the steady rhythm of the city. I did not need to call Ethan. Not yet. I did not need to confront Rachel. That moment would come, but it would come on my terms. As I stepped onto the sidewalk, the noise of the world moving around me, I allowed myself one final thought, quiet but certain. They believed this was the end of something, the final phase. But they were wrong. This was only the moment where everything began to turn.